We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. It's a pleasure to present today, Out of China, How the Chinese Ended the Era of Western Domination. Robert Bickers in conversation with Rana Mitter. Academic and writer Robert Bickers' latest work, Out of China, How the Chinese Ended the Era of Western Domination, masterfully depicts China's 20th century interactions with the outside world, thus unraveling the complex nature of their developing idea of nationalism vis-à-vis their painful encounter with Western imperialism. Interweaving political and cultural history, Bickers intricately lays bare China's internationalized landscapes with all its contradictions, violence, and ambitions. In conversation with academic and writer Rana Mitter, Bicker discusses the nuances of this narrative that form China's outlook of itself and the world at large. Robert Bickers is a historian of modern China and its relationship with the West. He grew up on Royal Air Force bases, studied in London, and has worked at the University of Bristol since 1997. He is currently a professor of history at the University of Bristol and has authored 6 books, including China Bound, John Swire and Sons, and Its World, Out of China, How the Chinese Ended the Era of Western Domination, and Written in China. Rana Mitter is a professor of the history and politics of modern China at the University of Oxford. His books include China's War with Japan, The Struggle for Survival, 1937 to 1945, and China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, Out of China, How the Chinese Ended the Era of Western Domination. Robert Bickers in conversation with Rana Mitter.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. It's great to be part of virtual Jaipur once again, and let's hope we're all soon rejoining each other in real life. It's also a huge pleasure to be in conversation with one of the most prominent historians of the relationship that China has had with the world, Robert Bickers. And Robert is someone who I've been discussing history with quite some years, so I hope audience will forgive us as there's a certain familiarity in the conversation here, but I hope that might mean that I can ask him a couple of tough questions and he won't feel too offended at various points too. We'll see if that works out. Robert, a huge pleasure to have you here, and welcome and congratulations on your book, Out of China. It's been very well reviewed in general. You must be pleased by how it's doing out there in the world, even while most of us are still a little bit locked away from the world.
Yes, indeed I am. Thank you, Rana, and good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be talking about the book again. Yes, I mean, I think it was a necessary book, and I'm pleased with the way it's been received, and with some of the questions, hard and otherwise, that it has had. So I'm interested to discuss it further and to hear what you've got to say.
Absolutely. So, very broadly speaking, Out of China, and of course the subtitle, How the Chinese Ended the Era of Western Domination, is a story that stretches across the 20th century. It's very much about the various ways in which, as I would put it, China moved from being a country that was weak in global terms, but sought to be strong, to where it is pretty much the present day, which is a country which is immensely strong, but often acts as if it were weak. Is that a fair characterization? And could you tell us a little bit more about the trajectory of the book so our participants today can get a bit more of a handle on it?
Yes, I can. So the book takes up where my previous book, The Scramble for China, concluded. And The Scramble for China explored the opening up of China and its effective subjugation by foreign powers in the 19th century. And I finished with the outbreak of the First World War, which came shortly after the end of the Qing dynasty, which had faced this threat, which had largely managed it, I argued, in ways that made the foreign assault on China, and we have to use words like that. There were at least 4 major wars in the period between 1839 and 1900 between China, 5, China and foreign powers. In modern Chinese history, it's almost easy to forget a war, but not in China. But I took the story forward from 1918, largely up to 1997. And this is a contemporary story. China's rise and China's perspectives on its past play a big role in its understanding of itself today, as you said. I mean, what is the process that happened? I mean, in 1997, the British handed over a colony on Chinese soil. And in fact, it wasn't the last colony on Chinese soil that was returned to Chinese rule. That was in 1999, and the Portuguese handover of Macau. But I watched the handover live on BBC TV, and perhaps you did as well, Ron. So a colonial handover took place when I already had this job here at the University of Bristol when I began my teaching. At the start of this process, I think we have to understand the position China was in. And one way of understanding it is imagining that my city here today, Bristol, in 1918, is partly subject to Chinese control. So let's imagine that a mile from my office here, there's an island called Spike Island. Imagine that that is actually territory of the Chinese state. And there's a Chinese consulate there, and the consul has quite a lot of power. Bristol's British residents are not allowed to live on that island. In fact, from time to time, they're not allowed to cross the bridges which go to that island and then on into South Bristol. And these are today a major thoroughfare for Bristolians coming to work in the centre. But that was the situation in Guangzhou, Canton, in 1918. An equivalent situation. There are, let's imagine, Chinese soldiers on Spike Island. There is a Chinese gunboat in the harbour. There are Chinese companies which control parts of the local economy. There is a Chinese temple that is perhaps just outside my office along there, because all of this, in a sense, is a reversal of what actually was the case in China. And China's young people, those who looked at this and wished to change it, were given hope in 1919, by the end of the First World War, and the Versailles negotiations to construct a new and lasting peace. That this situation, which has, this surreal echo in my presentation of Bristol, would be reversed. They were disappointed brutally in 1919. China's sovereignty, which had been systematically degraded since 1842, was not fully restored. And what my book does is look at how young Chinese and others worked to restore Chinese sovereignty. And I think they did so very successfully. But what we have today is a state which focuses on that national humiliation.
Could I jump in there for a second, Robert? You've given us a fascinating kind of panoramic layout of the way in which that very unusual situation with the relationship between the Chinese and Western foreigners in China operated in the early 20th century. But I'm conscious we're here, even if online, even virtually, at the Jaipur Literary Festival. And we've got viewers from around the world. Many of them will be from India. And that's, I think, one of the great pleasures of Jaipur, that we have such a cosmopolitan audience. And yet, even those who know the history of India under the British Empire will know that it's not quite the story that you're telling there. There is a point of difference. Because in a sense, the story of India, a city like Jaipur or Calcutta or Bombay, is a place that was under full colonial rule. And then, of course, many of us will know the rousing stories of independence, Gandhi, Nehru, and others who made their way in that journey to freedom in the 20th century. But what you're describing is a situation in China which is distinctive. In fact, a lot of historians, particularly Marxist historians, have used the term semi-colonial because it's sort of colonial and sort of not colonial. And it's almost a very unsatisfactory term to describe why in some ways it was difficult for the Chinese, because they weren't just fighting one occupier as the Indians were fighting the British. It was actually a whole variety of different types of forces, military, legal, diplomatic, from, more than a dozen countries at various points. Could you sort of delve into that situation a little bit more for us? And perhaps in that, add the word extraterritoriality. Hard to say, but a word that perhaps aroused anger amongst, the nationalist middle-class Chinese, almost more than even territorial occupation at that time.
Yes, indeed, I can. So in my little sketch of Bristol's alternative history, I had one foreign power, China. Imagine the Chinese city of Tianjin, 8 foreign powers with their own zones of control, their own municipal administrations, their own policemen, their own laws within that, and their own colonial forces within that. British Indian Army troops, young Sikh men recruited into the police force in Tianjin or Shanghai or Xiamen. Multiple colonialisms operating in China in different ways. You use the term semi-colonialism. Absolutely. China's first great revolutionary leader, Sun Yat-sen, father of the nation as he is known, called it hypo-colonialism. And for Sun Yat-sen, this was a worse situation, a controversial point, than full orthodox colonialism. Why? Because none of those 8 powers had anything remotely resembling a moral, and we could talk for hours about this, but a moral obligation to colonial subjects. They didn't, because China was not a colony, as you said. China retained its own government, its own governments. It fractured into civil war and multiple administrations in the 1920s and the 1930s. But it retained sovereignty in so many areas, even where it lost them in other ways. It lost the ability to fully control its own finances. It lost the ability to control its own customs revenue, to set its own tariffs, to control a key government monopoly like salt. It lost control over railways, which were constructed with foreign money by foreign engineers and owned by foreign interests. So for Sun Yat-sen, this was even worse. Extraterritoriality, extrality, as the diplomats used to term it, much easier to say, extrality.
Too many syllables, right?
Too many syllables. But it lends itself to song, actually. There's a lovely Stephen Sondheim song which involves extraterritoriality. I won't sing it because I can't sing. And it's not a singing matter. Extraterritoriality meant that Britons in China were subject to their own law. There was a British Supreme Court for China. And the same went for Americans and Russians up to 1917, the Germans, Austrians, Italians, French, the Japanese. I think that's it. So, in fact, it's not, there are more. So foreign nationals were subject to their own legal processes. They might be jailed in a British-owned jail halfway up the Yangtze River from the coast. So this seemed to many Chinese to be to allow foreigners carte blanche to do what they want and get away with it, including murder.
Well, could I throw a thought in there, because you've, I think, sketched out brilliantly the way in which the forces of foreign imperialism made themselves known in China, Britain, France, the US, and others. The Americans often like to forget that they were also an imperial power in China, but they absolutely were. They generally like to. I'm being a bit rude about Americans. It's not true of all of them, but some like to imply that the people who were sort of shooting down workers in the street were all British, and the missionaries helping people into peaceful ways of education were all Americans. And in fact, all sides were involved in all aspects of that.
Absolutely.
But having sketched out what the imperial presence is, and also I think, which is important, why it's different from somewhere like India, we need to talk a bit more about the resistance, I think, because that's a really important part of your book. And when you get partway through it, you suddenly start running into a bunch of people. They're out in the countryside in some cases, rather than in the big cities like Shanghai. And many of them have turned to a system of belief, which, as we know, became very, very important in the early 20th century. And that was communism. Now, we're interested in that story now because today China is ruled by the world's biggest and most powerful communist party, which shows no particular sign of being shaken out of office. And we've just passed, actually, we're 101 years on from the foundation of that political party, which was founded in 1921. But you talk about the Communist Party as, amongst other things, an expression of resistance to the foreign presence. So, people might think of communism as an economic system, and of course it is that too, but it's very much also about pushing back against the foreigners. So how does the story of China's communist revolution fit into the story you've just told us?
China was integrated into networks of news. People knew what was going on outside of China. They were aware of currents of new thought and new development and new resistance to existing regimes. The fall of the Tsarist Empire in 1917 echoed very loudly around the world. If we think specifically to the Versailles Peace Conference that I talked about and that betrayal, and that betrayal sparked protest in Beijing, led by...
Robert, you might want to just step in for a moment. I think many will know, but not all. Why was China betrayed at the Versailles Treaty, the treaty that ended World War I? What did that have to do with China, and why did China's nationalist leaders and students feel so angry about it? What was the cause?
China was actually one of the victors in World War I. It entered the war in 1917 on the Allied side. It had been courted by both the German and Austrian empires and by the British and the Americans and the French. It contributed manpower to the Western Front and to the Eastern Front, in fact. Tens of thousands of Chinese laborers went to work in labor corps. And of course, it contributed supplies and in other ways to the Allied war effort. It did so in the expectation that it would gain, and what it would gain would be a reversal of some of its losses to foreign power, specifically German loss, German seizure of territory and influence in Shandong province, and specifically Qingdao, where the beer comes from. And the beer comes from Qingdao because German entrepreneurs established a brewery there, and Tsingtao beer is now drunk across the world. But this was seized by Japan in 1914 at the beginning of the war. So an allied, a member of the victorious alliance at the peace conference in 1919 expects the defeated powers to be forced to surrender their gains to it. This did not happen. These were handed over to Japan. During the First World War, the Japanese government had pushed its influence into Chinese society and into Chinese politics. So in 1919, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's statements about what the new world would look like.
His 14 points about how the post-war settlement will be put together.
Absolutely. Self-determination of nations, but self-determination of nations did not apply to those who were suffering from the multiple colonialisms that China was suffering from. So when this was realized in 1919, young Chinese students in Beijing protested violently on the streets of the city in what became known as the May the 4th movement, which spread nationally. It was not the first such nationalistic movement in China, but it became one of the most profound. Now, if you have embraced the ideals of Woodrow Wilson, if you have embraced the ideals of European liberalism, in 1919, on May the 4th, you were confronted with their betrayal, as many saw it. So liberalism had not saved China and was not going to save China. So for many, they looked to an enemy of the new liberal victors in Europe, and that was the Soviet Revolution. And that's why the interest in Marxism and the power of the Soviet model starts to develop.
So we can see that the anger that exists more widely in Chinese society in the early 20th century, really after World War I, manifested itself in many ways as a desire, not perhaps in all cases literally to throw all foreigners out of China, but to remove these special privileges that that foreigners had in many parts of China itself. And to some extent, that echoes the experience that one has in other colonized societies around the world at the same time. But let's move forward a bit. And there's a tremendous amount in the book, and I'm going to try and sort of get some of the highlights here. I would say that there's a sort of step change in your book in the 1930s to the 1940s. And that becomes a very transformative moment for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that essentially the China of that time, and we should remind our listeners that viewers that is not the communist China of today. Chairman Mao does not get to be in charge of China until 1949. So this is the sort of China that's half forgotten that was before. It was under a leader then very famous, now somewhat forgotten perhaps, Chiang Kai-shek, a nationalist, a patriot, but fervently anti-communist. And he basically sets about resetting China's relationship with the world. Now, if people know anything much about Chiang Kai-shek, maybe they don't in later years today, they perhaps think of him as being somewhat pro-America, the opposite of Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong. But that obscures what I think is an important element of what you write about, Robert, which is that even though he was anti-communist, he was also deeply determined, as was his nationalist party, to remove foreign privilege from China. Can you tell us a bit more about that part of the story as it sort of moves us towards the middle of the century and more familiar territory, perhaps, for those of us who know the later period?
China's nationalists have, in many tellings of modern Chinese history, been reduced to an episode best forgotten. 2 decades of corruption and slavish support for the Americans. China's nationalists were nationalists. The Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek after the death of Sun Yat-sen, was a revolutionary nationalist party. It came to power through the revolution of 1926 to 27. It came to power actually through an alliance between the armed forces of the nationalist armies and the Chinese Communist Party. They worked together in a very close alliance until March, April 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek, still a radical anti-imperialist, feared as the Red General, a communist, turned on his Chinese Communist Party allies and bloodily repressed them. Chiang Kai-shek hated the British. I mean, if you read his writings or if you read his diaries for this period in the early 1920s, there are some lengthy rants about killing the British, destroying the British, fighting the British.
Could I add a gem from that particular repertoire as well, Robert? I read his diaries more for the 1940s, the World War II years, and one of the statements I like is that, or rather I find very kind of engaging, is at one point in his diary, Chiang Kai-shek says, "I despise the British, but I also admire them." And the reasoning for that was that he thought that they were the most cunning of any of the imperial powers, managing to persuade large numbers of people around the world somehow to do what they said. And I think he rather envied them for having that quality, because I think he wanted to work it out himself as a leader who ruled China for a quarter of a century, but never really quite got on top of it.
Well, yes, indeed. The British were the most powerful of Chiang's enemies until the 1930s. The British presence in China was the most pervasive, and Britain's one way or another, and British interests had the greatest amount of control over the Chinese economy, for example, until the Japanese invasions of the 1930s. Chiang Kai-shek was always a nationalist, and his regime came to power on the crest of this revolutionary wave across rural China and urban China, but then pretty quickly hit up against the realities of financing a government, of negotiating diplomacy, of negotiating an increasingly powerful Japanese threat. And the new regime, when it came to power, formally established itself in 1927, 1928, proclaimed that it would bring to an end extraterritoriality, that it would seize back all of these concessions in Shanghai, the heart of Shanghai, China's most important city, industrially, economically, financially, educationally, in so many ways, was run by 12 men with names like Bickers, or Smith, or Keswick, or Jones. But even as it did that, and even as they secured some gains, I mean, they managed to bully the Belgians out of their little concession in Tianjin, the Japanese threat got more urgent. And Chiang Kai-shek's and his movement's anti-imperialism had to be put on hold to deal with the Japanese seizure of large parts of the country in the north east of China in 1931-32, and then increasingly in East China. So Chiang Kai-shek had to put his revolution on hold. But as you said, even in the 1940s, he never lost sight of the fact that the British and other potential allies to combat the Japanese assault on China were also fair weather friends, useful until the time came when China could re-energize its wider nationalist agenda.
So we have a picture there, I think, Robert, and again, those who'd like to know more, I think, highly recommend that they should get a copy of Out of China. I think available in all good bookstores and even some possibly dodgy ones as well.
Absolutely.
Online, of course, as well. That takes us through this very turbulent mid-20th century. So we have the rise of nationalism in the 1920s and 30s. We have the rise of communism as people react to not only the presence of foreigners in China, but also economic injustice, which is, very, very prevalent at that time. And again, making that comparison for our purposes here with India, it's interesting that communism does take off in a significant way in China, in a way it doesn't quite in India during this period. It's a sort of different sort of nationalist tradition. There is, of course, a long-standing and important Communist Party of India, both then and now, but it wasn't dominant in the way that, of course, it came to be in China. And the Second World War also provides a real turning point in China. Again, different experience from India. India very much involved in the Second World War, not least sending thousands and thousands of troops as part of the empire effort, but also, of course, through Subhas Chandra Bose, a presence through the Indian National Army on the Japanese side. But China itself, of course, was a battlefield in the way that India wasn't. And that, of course, essentially devastates the country. It also provides circumstances in which eventually the communists, by then led by a man named Mao Zedong, became famous to the world as Chairman Mao, conquers China. And that happens in 1949. There's a civil war in which Mao takes over China. He announces from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the front of the Forbidden City in Beijing, that, well, he doesn't say it there, but he says elsewhere that the Chinese people have stood up in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace. He just announces that the PRC, People's Republic of China, has been founded. So that takes us on into the sort of culmination point, almost. These efforts to try and get rid of the foreign presence in China have succeeded. There are very few foreigners in China when Mao's in power during the time of communism. But even that doesn't seem to be enough to stem or end this really sort of strong fixation that China's communist leaders in particular have about throwing out not just foreigners, but foreign influence. And I think that culminates, couple of decades later in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. And again, many people might know a bit about this sort of almost internal civil war where Chairman Mao set the Communist Party against itself, and young teenagers were dressed up as so-called Red Guards in military uniforms, bullying and attacking their teachers and experts in the system to sort of force them to confess their revolutionary sins. And the reason I bring this up is the experience of one person you write about in the book, a woman named Nian Cheng, is a very good example of what happened to at least some Chinese who had stayed in China after the Communist Revolution, very much working with the system. But because of their foreign connections, because of connections, in fact, to the British, found themselves at the end of a very, very painful set of experiences. Could you tell us a bit about Ningguang and what her experience tells us more broadly about this period once the communists had taken over?
Sure. Yes, indeed. And I'm glad you mentioned Ningguang. It's a fascinating story. Ningguang studied in this country, in Britain, at the London School of Economics, and arrived, I think it was in 1936, was very involved in efforts amongst Chinese students and others in this country after the Japanese invasion entered its fullest phase in mid-1937, to raise awareness of this hideous conflict that was unfolding on the other side of the world, to try and persuade the British to act, to intervene, or British consumers to boycott Japanese goods, and so on. And Ningguang was at the heart of this sort of activity in this country. She stomped around Britain. She came to Bristol. In fact, she came to my university and spoke at a meeting here. She would go anywhere. She went to county fairs where and crowned the May Queen, and one in Wiltshire, to try and get the message across to British audiences. She married a fellow student who became a member of the nationalist government's foreign service. They spent part of the war years, the rest of the war years, in Australia. And in fact, her daughter was the first Chinese child born in Australia's capital territory. And returned to China at the end of the war, and he secured a job in the Foreign sort of Affairs Department in Shanghai. Ningguang was an Anglophile. She spoke fluent English. She liked red wine. She listened to European classical music. She had toast for breakfast with butter and jam. She was a cosmopolitan, and she was a nationalist activist. She was asked to take a role as a liaison between the British company Shell and the Chinese interests, which were working to take over its assets in China after the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party. She had all the skills. She socialized with the British in her circle of friends still remaining in Shanghai. She served the revolution and the new state's nationalistic agenda by helping dismantle this foreign company. She had served China's interests more widely in raising international sort of awareness of the assault on China. But in 1966, her home was attacked by Red Guards. She was a classic target for this iconoclastic, xenophobic, anti-imperialism of these young Chinese revolutionaries. And I would call it xenophobic.
Well, could you just run into that a little bit more, Robert? Because as we've been saying, China is taken over by Mao and by the communists in 1949. There are very few foreigners. There are some, a lot of Soviets, perhaps in the first decade or so, up to the early 1960s, and then Mao and the Soviets fall out. And there are just very few foreigners in China by the mid-1960s. So why should foreign presence be almost more of an issue for the Chinese government at the time when there were no foreigners in China, as opposed to at the time which you were telling us about, 10, 15 minutes ago, when there were thousands of foreigners in China?
Yes, indeed. But there are very few foreigners, but there are lots of Ningguangs. There are lots of men and women like her. There are lots of men and women who grew up in that more cosmopolitan world that had, of course, persisted. The world, which listened to jazz in Chinese-built hotels, which went to Hollywood films in the cinemas in Shanghai. Getting rid of the formal Western presence is one thing. Clearing China from the pervasive corruption of Western thinking, of Western culture, was another. And this was the target there. It wasn't just Niancheng, it was everything that she surrounded herself with, as it were, in her own home, in her connections, the fact that she spoke English, she'd studied overseas, it's about wiping the slate clean completely. This was, it was about the Cultural Revolution, and the energies of the Red Guards were aimed at restoring China's dignity from as they saw it, from a position of semi-slavery to foreign ways of thinking, which were un-Chinese and against the revolution.
So let me dive in there, Robert. We've got about 10 minutes left, and although there's a tremendous amount more in the book that covers the 60s and through the 80s and 90s, and of course 1997 is the formal endpoint of the book, the handover of Hong Kong. But rather than just talk about the history, I'd like to spend the last few minutes, if I may, talking a bit about what it all means now. And of course, the handover of Hong Kong happened in 1997. I think we've said before, you and I both watched it live, I think, on television. But in fact, in some ways, the aftermath of that handover has only really come to a culmination in the last few years, where Hong Kong has changed very, very considerably, not least with the imposition 2 years ago now, nearly, of the national security law, which has heavily clamped down on many of the freedoms, particularly freedom of media, that had existed up to that point in Hong Kong. The question I have for you is the phenomenon that you're looking at in the book, the way in which fear, anger, resentment of foreigners, which is by no means the only feeling that Chinese have for foreigners. They have admiration, they have reverence, they have respect, they have friendship as well. But in many cases, the fear and the anger have been very real as well. How far is that a factor in the way in which today's China is looking at the world? Because today's China is very different from the one that starts your book. It's only, in historical terms, a tiny amount of time, just a century, which is nothing. But at the beginning of the 20th century, China was weak. It was very heavily compromised in its sovereignty by the imperial powers. It was not a country that could shape its own destiny very easily. Today, China is the second biggest economy in the world, second biggest military in the world, has a very scratchy relationship with its neighbors, including India, of course, amongst those neighbors. China these days can tell the world a great deal about what China wants, and the world quite often has to say, yep, that's what we're going to do. How far is today's China really an inheritor of the China in your book, which seems much weaker and a much less effective global player at the beginning of your story?
We might look at China today in pre-COVID times, and I've done it myself in talks before. Where I, arrived in Shanghai and said, "Look, it looks the same. There's so much going on here which resonates and whatever." But as you say, this power is coupled with a sense of the legacies of the past and the dangers of the past as well. You ask about Hong Kong. One might think that one way of looking at it is that Hong Kong is full of millions of Nianchengs. 1 million people demonstrated in the largest of the demonstrations in 2019. 1 million people whose ways of thinking conflict very sharply, more and more sharply since 2019, with those of the People's Republic of China. And of course, Hong Kong is part of the People's Republic of China. So, part of, Hong Kong played a fascinating role in the re-energizing of China after the 1970s. It was the gateway to China. It was Hong Kong's entrepreneurs, Hong Kong finance, and so on, which helped restart re-globalized China in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It had a profound impact on China. And perhaps one might think, one might understand it as that there is still a fear that Hong Kong can continue to have a profound impact on China because of its different culture and its different understandings of what it means to be Chinese today, which is shaped by 150 years of a different course, a different legal system, different language, different cultural connections globally.
Robert, how far would you share a view which is being heard more and more in news media these days, which is that because of the national security law, because of the shutting down of many of the freedoms that Hong Kong had, for nearly 25 years since the handover, pretty much identical for much of that time to what they were under the British, relatively little democracy, but lots of freedom of expression. That essentially now Hong Kong is becoming, quotes, just another city like the mainland, just like Shanghai, just like Beijing. Is that fair, or is that too simple?
I think it's too simple. In fact, Nian Cheng's story, 20 years after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, just shows us how long-lasting the impact of that old Shanghai was. And in fact, Shanghai's culture and its strengths when it entered the 1980s very much linked to that longer term history of the fact that Shanghai was an open city and had been for so much longer. When negotiations started between the British and the Chinese authorities, the British would raise the point about Hong Kong public opinion and what might Hong Kong people think of this. And at one point, and there's a wonderful exchange where one of the leading negotiators on the Chinese side says, "We're Chinese, they're Chinese. We know what they think. You don't need to tell us." But of course, that view of "we know what they think" was based on profound ignorance of what Hong Kong people actually think, and the nature of Hong Kong society and its resilience since then. I mean, one of China's biggest worries has been the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And history plays, in Chinese analysis, history plays a large part of that. Nationalism plays a large part of that, but also history, allowing what it calls historical nihilism, allowing the critical examination of the Chinese past. And this happened in the Soviet Union. But if you allow, if you permit historians to do their business as they normally do, that can be weaponized. The history of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule in China is a history of tens of millions of unnecessary deaths, at least 1.5 million people killed during the Cultural Revolution, the 20th century's single most dreadful famine caused by Communist Party policies in the late 1950s. It's not a fabulous history. It's a history best controlled and shaped and expunged as far as possible. And that's what Chinese Communist Party's leaders have been doing.
So it's a reminder in some senses that the complexity of history is one of the things that's often hard to discuss in China today. And yet paradoxically, if it weren't for the fact that actually an awful lot of our colleagues who we know well are still, very, very assiduously and sometimes bravely writing some of the important history in China, we in the wider world, whether it's in India or in Britain or in the United States, would not, I think, have the fuller picture that we do today of what's going on in China. So it's a complex situation.
Absolutely.
Robert, you and I could go on talking about this for quite some time, but unfortunately time is against us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today. It's been a pleasure to be part of the 2022 Jaipur Festival online, and very much hope that we'll all see each other again in real life one of these days, one of these years. Thanks very much, Robert.
Indeed. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Robert Bickers and Rana Mitter, for this fantastic conversation. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all three of our venues: Front Lawn, Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Stay tuned for the next session.